From William and Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business and the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance, this is the 757 Recovery Podcast, a limited-run podcast series dedicated to helping the Hampton Roads community navigate the economic and social changes brought about by COVID-19. Today's episode is all about leadership. Our host will be Jeffrey Rich, Chief Marketing Officer at William and Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business.
Today, I'll be joined by two leadership experts within the Hampton Roads community, William & Mary Professor of Business Dr. Inga Carboni and Executive Director of the Executive Partner Program at William & Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business, Nancy Turner. Dr. Carboni and I will have a one-on-one discussion about leadership and the effect COVID-19 has had on the way leaders work. Dr. Carboni is an award-winning instructor, author of numerous journal publications, and a 2015 recipient of a Fulbright Teaching and Scholar Grant. She received her PhD in organization studies from Boston College, and since then, her work has appeared in many academic journals and books, such as Human Resource Management, Group Dynamics, the European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, and the Journal of Management Education. After my discussion with Dr. Carboni, the two of us will be joined by Nancy Turner. Nancy is a management consultant with the Stillwater Group, and she has over 25 years of managerial experience at places like Chevron Corporation, Royal Dutch Shell, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. In her current position as Executive Director of the Executive Partner Program, she leads over 100 volunteers who provide leadership coaching and mentoring to MBA and undergraduate students at William & Mary. So we're here with Inga, and Inga, you were telling me the other day about a completed study that you've been working on for a while, and it sounded pretty robust. Maybe you could just start by giving us a top line on what the study entailed and what were some of the key learning outcomes.
So when we started this, COVID wasn't even on the horizon, right? We wanted to understand how high-performing team leaders manage their teams, manage the internal practices of their teams. We're looking at the networks that are inside the team, the networks between team leaders and external stakeholders, as well as some quality of the relationships, both in the internally and externally. So we interviewed 100 top-performing team leaders across 20 different organizations. These are all very large organizations. I think the smallest we dealt with was only about 5,000. So they're major organizations.
Tell us about some of the tactics that really rise to the top in terms of their effectiveness.
A lot of people who are lucky enough to be working are doing so remotely. And one of the problems that we're facing is that we're not used to doing that. And it does take a particular kind of personality to have created the internal structure and discipline to be working at home. And those people who've done it for 20 years, I've seen a lot of things on the internet, this is what keeps me going, they're different. They're not the same as the kind of workers who actually prefer to be in the workspace. So some of the tactics that we want to deal with are the similar impulse. How do we create human connection? How do we learn to trust each other? And one of the classic ways to do that is to connect over things that are not work-related, to get to know somebody in a deeper, more personal way. That builds trust. Trust is essential to innovation. Trust is essential to swift coordination. Trust is essential to performance when performance relies upon collaboration. Trust is essential to well-being and to thriving. We need this. So there's lots of different ways to do that. One of the things that I was astounded by was the number of one-on-one meetings that team leaders do, that high-performing team leaders do. Weekly with their direct reports. Quarterly with all their skip levels. And that's in addition to team meetings or team huddles and all the project-related meetings or the movements that they have to do to connect with people. I would not recommend that people step back and let people find their way. That is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to check in regularly, to set up times where you're talking to people. Nowadays, it's going to be over the phone or it's going to be video conference, but that you're having that connection, that you're discussing what's going on with people, what they're doing, but you're building into that time a conversation for off-task. So one leader, for instance, makes sure that at least 5 minutes are spent in off-task conversation. What's going on? What should I know about? Or just what's your reaction? How are things today? What's bothering you? What's your biggest challenge going on right now? Those are things you can do in a team space as well. A simple way, start your meetings with a 2-minute check-in. What are you excited about today? What's on your mind? And what do others need to know?
So how does that old paradigm of layered organizations and bureaucratic processes need to change as we enter this world of virtual work, which I would assume won't end with the pandemic, but a lot of businesses will likely awaken and feel this is perhaps a good way to foster a productive workforce.
As we look back on this time and as this time continues, we might see that there is more possibility in having people work remotely, even when it's perfectly possible to come back into the workplace and work together. And I think there's a couple of driving forces from that. I think there's people who never thought that they would want to work remotely are finding actually that it works out pretty well. I think there's also a lot of people who are reluctant to let their workers go remotely are finding that productivity is not suffering dramatically as a result. I certainly have talked to my friends in the big cities who are very happy not to be commuting. The trick is keeping people engaged, and people get engaged not just with you, the leader, but with each other. And the best managers find a way to do that, and we've captured some of those practices. But it's not like farming out work to somebody who happens to live in a different country or somewhere else. They're part of your team, and the things that build trust, the things that contribute to innovation, the things that contribute to performance and productivity and well-being are just as true whether somebody's in the cubicle next to you or they're 1,000 miles away.
What do you do in a situation where you may have a team member, for example, that wants that degree of independence, wants to be trusted, that you have confidence that they know how to do their job and they'll be effective in it. But you as the manager have to compile information. One of your jobs is to not just seek perspectives from people, but to assimilate information, to move it along in the communications process so initiatives get, proper transparency and all. And you get maybe negative feedback or pushback or the feeling essentially like you're over communicating with me. Hey, you're infringing on my structured work time. So how do you deal with a situation like that when you've got somewhat competing interests, a desire to stay more independent from the team member, but your need to communicate perhaps more than they might feel comfortable because you have needs that you have to fulfill as a manager?
So I think you're talking about the tension between accountability and trust. And I would never recommend you just tell people, go on, do your thing, So I think it's absolutely possible and preferable that you have, weekly check-ins with all of your direct reports. And again, that you do skip level on a fairly regular basis as well. But there's plenty other ways of managing accountability. So a common way of managing accountability is for early team meetings to break out what are the tasks that need to be done, who's ultimately the responsibility for them, who needs to be involved as a decision maker, who needs to be advised, who needs to be informed, and who needs to be consulted in the process, so that people are very clear on whose responsibility are different tasks. You line out the timelines, how things are supposed to be doing, and you put that in a shared team space. And there's lots of them these days. Teams does a nice place, Slack, Yammer, all those kinds of things create a space where you could put that kind of information. It can be as simple as an Excel file. And in the weekly check-ins, part of that, but not all of it, part of it is, tell me how you're doing. What challenges are you facing? What do I need to know? So that the accountability part of it is sort of taking care of itself in what should be a shared document so that everybody on the team can see it, right? Because it's the team project. And if I'm responsible for this task, everyone's seeing where I'm at with that task. Has it been done? We set a deadline. Has it been done? Or has the deadline been moved? And when challenges arise, that comes up in those one-on-ones and those team meetings, right? I don't recommend not having team meetings. Those are also something that are important for teams to do. You discuss them, you talk about them, and you make adjustments.
Well, it sounds like, the sort of the drive-through idea there is clearly communicating, setting clear expectations, publishing those, making sure that the team feels some sense of ownership in them, and then continuing to come back to those priorities as the things you point to that organize people and their activities. So no secret, that's always one of the successful components of effective management. If you had to think of one behavior to stay away from, the thing that leads to disgruntled team members, unproductive work environments, missing of goals, are there one or two things that really rise to the top in terms of behaviors to stay away from?
Well, I guess maybe three come to mind. So a big one would be lack of clarity about expectations for the individual, about expectations for the team, expectations for project deliverables and things like that. And some of that can be co-created with the individuals or the teams, but I think it's very stressful for people not having that clarity. And it's one of the biggest reasons that we would hear people complaining about senior leadership, where they're not sure exactly what senior leadership wants. So I would say lack of clarity is a huge stressor on teams, a real problem when you're working remotely, and just something that team leaders need to do in general. And that can go hand on hand with micromanaging. Micromanaging is when you are very focused on telling people how to do things more and as much as what needs to be delivered or done. But focusing too much on people on how they do things is a sure way of killing motivation and spirit and creativity and innovation and all those kinds of good things. And I guess maybe the third thing to avoid was failing to understand them as people and as individuals who have their own dreams and aspirations and motivations and quirks and fears and anxieties. It's damaging to the work that you need to get done. It's damaging to the commitment that people will feel to you and to the organization. That affects the work too. I mean, it's sort of the right thing to do, but that also affects the work and the productivity when you get people who are burned out, disengaged, and finally leaving you or the organization.
Perfect. Dr. Inga Carboni, we thank you for your time today, and these were invaluable insights as managers throughout the country try and figure out how to cope with the new normal, how to deal with the array of personalities that come to work every day virtually now. So thank you very much for the insights, and we appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
We'd like to take a moment to introduce our partners, Crimdell Small Business Network. We understand that as a small business, these times of crisis can be riddled with uncertainty. Crimdell, in association with the Hampton Roads SBDC, is offering free 10-hour counseling services to small business owners within the greater Williamsburg area to help navigate your business through the pandemic. To learn more, reach out at crimdellsbn@gmail.com or follow them on Facebook.
So our discussion on leadership doesn't stop here. Now joining Dr. Carboni and myself is William & Mary's own Nancy Turner, Executive Director of the Executive Partner Program at the Raymond A. Mason School of Business. So we're continuing our conversation and have brought Nancy Turner into the conversation this morning. Nancy leads our Executive Partners Program at the Raymond A. Mason School of Business, which is a group of late stage and retired executives that have storied and accomplished careers at major corporations across the United States and the world, really, and also works as a management consultant with the Stillwater Group. Nancy, welcome, and maybe tell us a little bit more about your background.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. One of the questions I've received from both executive partners as well as students is working virtually. So part of my background is as a management consultant. I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers and then was in a small consulting group at Royal Dutch Shell. Worked internationally, worked virtually for the last 25 years of my career.
You also work with the executive partners that I mentioned earlier. What are some of the differences in perspectives that you see across those generations of leadership?
So what's really interesting is the similarities. And one of the things I found out last night is how uncomfortable they were working together online. So they had really never had that experience working on problems, working in teams online, and they were really uncomfortable, and they really appreciated the opportunity to be able to collaborate and practice what it's like working online. And it's the same thing with executive partners. You know, we're in a situation where a lot of my colleagues have never worked virtually. I mean, I was just fascinated last night with how students were struggling as much as EPs were.
My experience is that although some of the older workers may not be as facile with technologies or know about the whole breadth of technologies or being able to stay on top of what's the newest, greatest technology for doing something, what they are very good at is building relationships, knowing how to work with people to get the best out of them. And the younger people, that's something that they could really benefit from. They're terrific at the technologies. They can use them much better. They know what new thing came out just the previous week and what's the best way to communicate a particular idea. But they struggle with forming relationships as well. And I think it's a great partnership with the older employees and the younger ones coming into the workforce. I think there's wonderful opportunities for reverse mentoring and wonderful opportunities for old style mentoring as well.
So what's the consensus? I got to ask, is, a general consensus that it's a more productive, easier way to work? And how have you seen over a course now, since we've been at this for a good 3 or 4 months, have we reached adoption?
I think it takes time. So through the years, for me, it's become second nature. And I think part of it was embracing the tools, embracing the whole concept that we're working virtually, embracing the tools. So using instant messages, using Zoom meetings, different tools and processes, but we're still doing the same thing. We're still having a pre-meeting, making sure we're ready to go. We have a presentation. We're checking in at breaks, and we do a debrief at the end of the day. So there's a lot of what I do is very similar. It's how I do what I do that's different. The more time that goes by, the easier it is to focus and be present. It just is, I think it's practice.
I want to bring Inga back into the conversation and ask, should one assume that not everybody has the skills to be successful working day to day in a remote environment? Nancy talked about some base level training just in video conferencing skills, what to do, what windows to open, what features to turn on. What are leaders in organizations doing and thinking about to make sure that folks across their entire enterprise are positioned to be successful, and how important is that today among the things that leaders need to really think about?
Everybody needs to coordinate, and you've got to work out, basic stuff, right? Like, what time do we meet? When I've got a counterpart in Hong Kong, when does the team meet, right? So that just those sort of basic things are happening. But leaders who are embracing this new method realize that those opportunities for connection can be lost. Because there is this tendency to go, okay, we can be hugely efficient. We can block out our time. Here's our agenda. Let's get through our steps. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, it's 9 o'clock. I got to go to my next Zoom meeting. It's upon leaders to start using the technology to foster the ability for people to brainstorm, to get to know each other, to share the kinds of ideas and thoughts that people talk about before when you'd pop your head into somebody's office and you'd say a few words, you're walking down the hall, or the small talk before a meeting or after a meeting. Leaders now have to build that into their time and the way they interact with people.
Nancy, you've worked as an organizational development and effectiveness executive and coach, companies all around the world. What have you seen in terms of effective ways to build trust within the workplace? Are there exercises, strategies, but what have you seen work really well in your experience?
One of the things we talked about was leadership traits. So I think it is setting clear direction so that we exactly understand what's expected of us. A good leader sets high expectations, holds us accountable, doesn't let things fester. So I think all of those great leadership qualities are just as important or even more important in a virtual environment. And one of the things that I suggested to build trust was for people just to talk about their educational background and their experience. And it was amazing how quickly people were able to say, I understand who this person is, and I can trust them to do the work that we're expected to do. This person's going to toe the line. So it was amazing how quickly the team formed and was able to, in a very short amount of time, come back with, well, here's one scenario for what we can do given the situation we're in. So it can be as simple as, introducing ourselves in a way that builds confidence that we have the capability to do what's expected of us.
One of the themes that have come back through a bit of Dr. Carboni's research too is the need to build more of a social component to conversations. And it's probably easier to do in one-on-one conversations with, say, direct reports, where you can have a 5-6 minute maybe discussion at the beginning. How's your family doing? Sort of bringing back. more of a personal component to the conversation. But when you're in a group dynamic and working virtually, what's the balance between structuring that conversation and then opening up, whether it's the beginning or the end of the meeting, to have a little bit of free-form discussion?
In my experience as an organization development consultant, part of my role is to be very intentional about how the meeting's organized. So we have a meeting, I was in a meeting recently where we were celebrating a success. There really wasn't agenda, wasn't about doing teamwork, but it was about celebrating a project that was approved. So part of what I did was look at how do I plan a session where we can come together and celebrate our success. And part of it was creating some good questions that created conversations that allowed us to go back and understand what made this possible. What do we do that created this success? What have we learned? It was a well-organized session that really created the opportunity for us to honor what we've done in a virtual way. One of the other questions I got was about burnout. How do we connect and stay in touch and understand when somebody needs a break?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and Dr. Carboni talked quite a bit about that. Not burning employees out and striking that balance between having the right amount of meetings. So I think striking that balance and figuring out, how do I have enough interaction among team members and structure enough, whether it be one-on-one or group setting discussions, but step back and let people have some time to get work done as well. And I think that's probably among the greatest challenges of leaders and managers in any organization coming out of the pandemic, especially because it's much harder.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's about building relationships. I think it's about a good leader who is encouraging, who respects people, who fights for his or her people, who knows his or her people, knows their capabilities, has enough personal connection that there's trust, there's openness. People are willing to have a conversation about, my mother has COVID. This is a very difficult time for me. Or I am struggling. This wasn't exactly the job I expected. And what do I need to do to get on board?
One small piece of that is just to look at people's work streams and say, listen, what do we need you in? Where are you really a decision maker? Where do we need to consult you? You don't need to be in these 3 meetings. These are just FYI meetings. Let's put the decisions made in these meetings into a shared space that you can consult if you need to. Otherwise, let's protect your time. You want to be constantly engaged. I talked to one leader. You want to only be working, or the majority of your time, 80% of your time, to be on high impact projects, particularly if they're high effort. Whatever you're doing, you want to be putting 80% of your time on high impact. And most of us spend 80% of our time on low impact work.
Well, it certainly seems that the pandemic has created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for leaders to really stop and rethink everything that they're doing. Their organization is focusing on, measure against that spectrum of high impact to low or no impact. And really rethink the workplace. So I guess if there's a silver lining through all of this, it's an opportunity to take an evolutionary step in how we work and how we collaborate with one another, how we focus our daily activities to be more productive. And I think in the end, that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And some of the high-performing leaders that I talked to were already doing this. So they were limiting the number of meetings they had in a day to 5. And suggesting that to all of their employees. Manage your calendar so you don't have more than 5 meetings a day. They would create dark times, right? So nobody sends emails on Fridays between noon and 6 p.m. Or you put all emails over the weekend on delay. Whatever. Some organizations that doesn't work, but a lot of them it can. So there's ways of helping people manage some of their time, and some of the forward-thinking leaders have been doing this for a while, but these are clearly tactics that are even more needed today.
I'd like to thank Dr. Inga Carboni and Executive Director of William & Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business's Executive Partners Program, Nancy Turner, for their time with us this morning. And I wish everyone continued success as we try and cope with the new normal coming out of the pandemic and the new ways that we all have to approach work today. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Jeff.
And there we have it. That concludes our discussion on leadership with Dr. Inga Carboni and Nancy Turner. Thank you to our listeners for joining us here today for the 5th episode of the 757 Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Rich.
The 757 Recovery Podcast is brought to you by the William and Mary Raymond A. Mason School of Business and the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance. Executive producers include Jeffrey Rich and Katie Copey. Associate producers include Kevin Clark, Sophie Morris, Jack Cornett, and Ishan Kantpur.